Romans 14, Unplugged, Feasts and Fasts and Food. Oh my. And let's take about 15 minutes or so and work our way through this. It's easy to get lost in a study like this because we go week after week and we bite off just a little bit by little bit, and then we have a little break when I'm moving or my computer's not working or something like that. So there will be a little bit of catch-up to do, but basically I wrote a study. It's available on my website at tatesoftorah.com on Romans 14, and it's as short as I can make it. The overall gist of the study is trying to ascertain whether or not Paul's message to his readership here is his way of saying to everyone, both Jew and Gentile, you guys just need to erase all your differences, whether you're Jew or Gentile, doesn't matter. Whether you've been raised to keep Torah or not keep Torah, all of that doesn't matter. And whether you were raised to keep kosher and keep special Sabbath day, all of that, what ultimately matters is that we need to come together and worship together, worship God together, recognize Messiah, Yeshua together, and put our differences aside and don't let those petty things divide us. And so the general overall perspective of this chapter from our standard historical Christian approach, religious approach, again, this is not counting religious Judaism because they don't study the book of Romans, but from a traditional Christian approach, as far as Messianic Judaism is concerned, if you'd like to be a Messianic Jew and keep Torah and keep kosher and keep Sabbath, that's fine. Just don't judge people for not keeping those things. And if you're a Gentile Christian, on the other hand, and you're not Jewish, and you don't want to keep kosher, you don't want to keep Sabbath, you don't want to keep special days and things like that, that's fine as well. The big point is that we need to just accept one another and love one another. And so that's the overall thrust of the perspective that we walk away with when we listen to sermons on this passage and things like that. And it sounds okay at the surface. I mean, I'll be honest with you, it sounds okay, sounds workable. But here's the challenge. When we go back to 2,000 years ago to Paul's day, we're going to find that that type of message where Paul would have been telling Gentiles, believers, you don't have to worry about keeping Sabbath and kosher, and would have been telling Jewish believers, you don't have to keep those things anymore either if you don't want to. In other words, all of these decisions that you make as a communities, Sabbath keeping, kosher keeping, festivals, and all those things, all of that's up to vote. Let's send in your provisional ballot, send in your mail-in by vote. Right? No, I'm just teasing you, seriously. Let's put it up to a vote. No, historically, Paul probably would not have gotten away with that type of logical process of allowing God's commandments to be put to a popular vote. So we've got to rediscover this passage from its historical perspective, and then once we feel like we've got a grasp on what this passage means to us historically, we can then launch into a modern day application for our own communities and see where we can make some halakha, some group policies. So that's what I'm doing with this commentary. To the best of my ability, I'm trying to find out what this letter meant to the recipients first, how they would have interacted with the terminology, and then from there launch into a practical application and ask the question, what does this verse mean to you? What does it mean to me today? How can I apply it to my life as a Messianic Jewish man? So we're in the section where we're asking this question of verses 5 through 9, are Christians free to worship God any day of the week? Because if you've noticed, if you look on my screen, in verse 5 and 6, Paul comes out saying one person esteems one day as better than another, while the other esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. And then verse 6, the one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains in honor of the Lord, gives thanks to God. That's from the ESV. And then we've got some Greek that we're going to look at it here just in a bit. And the point is, the question is asked, is Paul putting the Sabbath day to a vote? Is he saying to the communities of his day, some of you guys who are Jewish are bringing a Sabbath observance into the equation, and some of you guys who are Gentiles are bringing a non-Sabbath day, maybe a Sunday worship. And so I, Paul, am going to play the mediator between the two of you, and I'm going to tell you that it really doesn't matter whether you keep Sabbath or not, and it doesn't matter whether you keep Sunday or not. What what you guys need to do is just kind of make a decision, put it up to a vote. Get your ballots in, get your provisional ballots in, get your mail-in ballots in. Make sure there are no hanging chads or anything like that, no dimpled votes. And then count the votes, right? Make sure the tally's right. And if you have to put it up for a recount, do that. But once you have all your votes in, then come to a decision as a community, and whatever you guys decide on, then I, Paul, sign off on it as well. Whatever you guys are on board with, I'm on board with. Is that the way we should interpret this passage? So that's the section that we're in, and I'm not ashamed to tell you my answer where I think Paul's going with this. I think, and then I'll jump right into the study, I think this is the bottom line up front, right? The bluff, the bottom line, the TLDR version, right? Too long, didn't read. I think that Paul is not talking about Sabbath days when he says one person esteems one day as better than another. I think there's a very strong case that, given the surrounding context, that Paul is actually talking about optional fasting days. What days were certain communities fasting on in the Jewish community? What days were the Christians adopting along with the Jews in the community as fast days? And since the Bible is noticeably silent on mandating fast days, then they became days that could be voted on, or days that could be decided for different communities. And the point is that on those days of fasting came along whether the abstention or the eating of certain foods. And along with that, we had Jews who were already abstaining from certain foods based on what the Torah said, and add to that the abstaining from foods that were ostensibly tainted from idolatrous practices in the Greco-Roman society of the first century. So all of that come together to say that it's unlikely that Paul is talking about a Sabbath versus Sunday issue debate here. It's certainly too early in history to bring up a Sabbath versus Sunday. That's not going to come along for another couple hundred years, in my estimation, and based on the studies that I've undertaken. So it's better not to read Paul saying, if you want to keep Sabbath, great. If you want to keep Sunday, great. Instead, what Paul is really telling the people, hey, if you want to fast on this day, that's fine. If you don't want to fast on this day, that's fine. And on your fast day, if you want to abstain from food, that's fine. And if you don't want to abstain from that food, that's fine. But what I, Paul, recommend is that we, as a community of God, we all line up with the Word of God, which means we are keeping kosher according to what God's Word tells us as a community of God, both Jews and Gentiles in Messiah. We do what God says, and when it comes to holy days, we certainly hold those days as well. In fact, he's not even really bringing Sabbath into the discussion. It's very unlikely that he is. And even if he is, it's not something that's debatable, open for debate. So let's look at this. I've got this little excursus in the middle of my commentary, and I read part of this last 2 weeks ago, and I need to read part of it again because it didn't record. I'm only going to read this first section here. I've got a lengthy quote from a gentleman that substantiates the first part. So let me just read part of this. What I said 2 weeks ago is that while perhaps not central to addressing the immediate issue of Romans 14:5 and 6, the question at hand, are Christians free to worship God any day of the week? Nevertheless, one of my keen longtime Torah study buddies, who's actually in the class right now, his name begins with an L and ends with an E, and it's not the married gentleman. It's the younger one. You know who I'm talking about. 4-letter name. He brought it to my attention. He's fond of pointing out that many Bible readers may not be aware of the fact that in verse 6 there's a significant variant in the Greek manuscripts when comparing the 16th century Textus Receptus and other related Byzantine type manuscripts, such as the Stephanus, the Scrivener of the Byzantine majority, and the G&T, with the older yet more recently discovered minority Alexandrian texts, such as the Nestle-Aland, UBS, the Westcott and Horde, and the Tischendorf types of manuscripts. So all I'm trying to say is we've got a variant. There are two main textual families when it comes to Bible translations that you can pick up in the store today, your English translations, ESV, KJV, NASB, NIV, all those types of Bibles. Most of them are relying on two primary types of manuscript families that fall into two broad camps. And I'm putting a little screenshot on my screen right now in post-production that shows some of those details between those two manuscript families. But the bottom line is it ends up resulting in, when we're talking about translations, it ends up being, since some manuscript families contain more text in the Greek than others, we end up with longer versions of a passage than we do with another version. So if you compare, like, say, KJV versus maybe NIV, or KJV with ESV or something like that, NASB, then you'll find like a longer version versus a shorter version in comparing those two Bibles, and that's just what's going on. And so what I go on to say is that, starting on here, basically some Bibles show a shorter reading for verse 6 and some Bibles show a longer reading for verse 6. But in my opinion, as a Bible student, the overall general message that Paul was trying to convey to his original audience seems largely unaffected no matter which manuscript representation we believe to be original version of the letter. So we have a longer textual Greek, and we ask our question, is this the longer version? And we have a shorter version, and we ask ourselves, was this a scribal error? Was it meant to be longer at first and then somehow it got chopped out? Or perhaps Paul actually wrote the shorter version and then scribes came along and added words that weren't originally there. And so people who are like into textual criticism and kind of biblical purists, kind of absolutists, kind of want to know, okay, I want to know exactly which one's the most accurate one because I'm going to base my Bible translation on which one's more accurate. Well, unfortunately, we may not know with absolute certainty which one is the one that Paul wrote, the longer version versus the shorter one. And it's within that thought that I say that while not a KJV only, King James only advocate, nonetheless, Dr. James White of Alpha and Omega Ministries makes a conclusion to this verse that supports the longer reading. So the one that shows up in your King James Version with the longer, more words, Dr. White believes that this is probably what Paul wrote originally. And he states, quote, the verse's second section contains a balanced statement by the apostle, while the first contains only one side of the argument. The added material balances out the entire passage. That's in the opinion of Dr. James White, someone with more Bible degrees than I have myself. And so I lean on his interpretation, and I tend to think that that's a very valuable contribution. Indeed, a plausible conclusion that can be drawn as to whether we should prefer the longer Textus Receptus, which is known as the majority text version, to the shorter Alexandrian minority text version can be found on this gentleman's BibleDifferences.net blog to the passage in question. And I'm not going to read the whole quote for brevity's sake. I'll just jump down to this final paragraph here, which reads, in our verse of investigation, both the internal and intrinsic criteria makes a very strong appeal toward the longer version found in the Byzantine manuscripts to be in agreement with the original and not the version found in Alexandrian manuscripts, which represents the shorter read. This gentleman goes on to say that Bruce Metzger, an expert in textual critique, pointed out that one should be aware that the original might sometimes be preserved in the Byzantine manuscripts, which is the longer read, the one that we discovered historically first, but was actually turns out to be the newer when it comes to the dating of the manuscript. So the Alexandrian is an older manuscript, but we didn't discover it until later, till more recently. We've been using the older majority texts, meaning older in terms of when we discovered them, but it turns out when we put the two manuscripts side by side and dated them, the Alexandrian ones are older than the majority, the Byzantine, the A versus the B. And so in this case, it turns out to be that probably the one that we discovered, the more recent one in date, is probably the one that Paul originally wrote. I believe that this is one of the more prominent cases, is what this gentleman says. So that's the end of my excursus there. And let me jump now after looking at that, as I mentioned, whether you go with the longer read or the shorter read, and we look, in case you're curious, if you look on my screen now, the variant is very short. I mean, it's this short little bracketed part here, which in the KJV is, you would see that extra wording there. It talks about he who doesn't observe it, he who doesn't eat, doesn't eat to the Lord, and things like that. And it's a very, like I said, a very minor thought that's added. Whether it got chopped out in a copyist error or something like that, it doesn't change the overall perspective of what Paul's trying to talk about. So having said all that, let's jump now into the main section that we're going to be looking at tonight. We won't finish this tonight. We're just going to take a bite out of it for the next 5 or 10 minutes or so, and begin to work through this question of whether or not Paul is bringing up a Sabbath versus Sunday debate. And as I mentioned earlier in my the kind of conclusion, my summary statement is that I do not believe that Paul is presenting us here in Romans 14 with a Sabbath versus Sunday choice. And part of the reasons behind that are because Paul himself demonstrated a lifelong commitment to the written word of God as the single standard for Jewish and Gentile covenant members, particularly those in Messiah. Paul championed Torah observance for Jews and Gentiles. As odd as that may sound to Gentile listeners to this video and this podcast, who might think, no, Paul never taught that Gentiles have to keep Torah. I beg to differ. He certainly taught Torah observance on a continued basis for Jewish believers, such as himself, but I believe it can be shown quite conclusively that he also championed a continued Torah observance for Gentile believers in Messiah, because they had been brought into this relationship with God through the Son, and therefore into a relationship at a natural level with Israel. They didn't become Jews, but they did become Israelites at a spiritual level, or we could say at a covenant level. They became Israelites, remnant Israelites. They didn't overtake Israel. They didn't displace Israel. The church didn't it's not a zero-sum game where only one person can be Israel. Rather, Israel's borders expanded to include Gentiles from the nations, and so they were grafted into Israel. And thus Gentile believers become a part of spiritual Israel at the remnant level. National Israel still has her blinders. She still doesn't believe in Messiah Yeshua. But Paul is going to champion the Torah for Israel, and to the degree that you find yourself in Israel, whether you're on the national Israel side of the house, and I think I'm going to put a little graphic here that shows the overlapping of those two circles like you've seen in the past, where I got national Israel on the left side and remnant Israel on the right. The Gentile nations on the right, and they overlap with one another. And in that slice in the middle, kind of like a MasterCard logo, that little slice in the middle is remnant Israel. Gentile believers in Jesus take on the remnant Israel identification, and thus the scriptures that God gave to Israel of old applies to the church at that level. So, having said that, let's read some of this commentary and work my way down through this. We won't finish tonight. We'll just take a little bit as we go. I have to say, so the immediate oft-asked question related to these two verses is, are Christians free to worship God any day of the week? I think I've got a little short little SQSA video that I produced on this same question for my e-Bible study that I did a few years back, and so probably next week we'll watch the little video, are Christians free to worship God any day of the week? We'll see my answer in video form. I go on to say, in one sense, believers are free to worship God any day of the week, and I believe that we should be worshiping Him every day of the week, right? I think most believers, both Jewish and Gentile, would agree with me there. I go on to say, however, our Messianic freedom should not separate us, but cause us to pursue what makes for mutual upbuilding, using Paul's own wording in Romans 14, verse 19. I go on to say, I can say that I've studied many varied commentaries on this passage, such as Calvin, Murray, Dunn, Lloyd-Jones, Bruce, Barth, Hendrickson, Stuhlmacher, Cranfield, Nanus, Haig, MacArthur, Stern, Lancaster, Janicki, and others. And in my estimation as a Bible student, Romans 14:5 does not seem like a likely passage teaching freedom from Sabbath worship, viz. Sabbath versus Sunday. So I don't think this is Paul's way of saying, if you want to keep Sabbath, great. But if you don't want to keep Sabbath, you're not obligated to what the Torah teaches. Again, there are manifold issues with Paul telling at least the Jews in his day that you don't have to be obligated covenantally to what God handed down through Moshe. That simply would not have been received in the Jewish communities of Paul's day. It's certainly not received in today's Jewish communities, to include the Messianic Jewish communities that I'm aware of, to have Paul saying, well, Sabbath keeping, kosher keeping, all of the Bible that Moses handed down is all optional whether you want to keep it in Messiah or not. That doesn't seem to be well received in any Messianic circle that I'm aware of. It only seems to be received, unfortunately, in traditional Christian communities where we've not been exposed to maybe an alternate way of understanding Paul's writings. And so I'm presenting us with that, what I believe it to be a better way of understanding Paul's writings. I go on to say, I feel the best way to interpret verse 5 is within the larger context, and you have to read verse 6 and the rest of the chapter as well. And that would make it a verse about voluntary fast days, right? Not one day as being a Sabbath versus Sunday, but a fast day versus a non-fast day. And I base my position on a number of historical and textual clues. So let me just read down through these bullet points, and then that will draw our study to a close tonight for Romans 14. And let's turn to the Shema study. Here are 4 bullet points that help me draw some of the conclusions that I do as to why I think Paul is not presenting us, Jew and Gentile, in his day, with the option to take a vote on whether or not we should keep Sabbath versus Sunday. Here are some of them. This is not exhaustive. These are just some of the highlights that come to mind. First bullet point, the Sabbath is God's covenantal sign to Israel, right? And remember, Israel, from Paul's perspective, includes remnant Israel, which I'm going to mention here in a second. But according to Exodus 31:13 and Ezekiel 20, verse 12, go back and read those passages on your own. The Gentiles grafted into remnant Israel would have had a natural association with seventh-day Sabbath worship. Read Acts 14:1 as well as Acts 15:21, where we see Gentiles being brought into a relationship with God through Jesus the Messiah, but at the same time, like Paul's going to tell us in the book of Ephesians, these Gentile believers are brought into a relationship with national Israel at the remnant Israel level, so that are brought into the commonwealth of Israel, is the verbiage Paul's going to tell us in Ephesians chapter 2. Second bullet point reads, at the time the book of Romans was written, which was around 55 to 56 CE of Paul's day, first century, official, quote, Sabbath versus Sunday, end quote, debates were not extant. They just weren't existent, right? It's a little too early to be making this a Sabbath versus Sunday debate. That's not going to come around until, as I mentioned, Sunday would not become the established Christian day of worship until a few hundred years later. So I don't think Paul would even be bringing in this option for us at all. It's just anachronistic to say that. Bullet point number 3, for Paul to casually, emphasis on the word casually, recommend in one verse the personal choice to give up on seventh-day Sabbath in favor of Sunday worship seems highly unlikely given the weight of received Torah passages such as Exodus 31:16 and 17, where Moshe tells Israel that this is a day of worship for Israel, between Israel and God forever, and it's a day that you should continue to recognize because God is the creator. It's a sign of his creatorship, and it's a Sabbath. It's a sign of the covenant that God made. The Sabbath itself is a sign between Israel and God, and therefore it's something that should be established, not something that should be taken up for a vote by popular vote or any such thing. So it's highly unlikely that Paul would have brought the Sabbath before the communities of the first century to be voted upon. And I go on to say the establishment of Sabbath in the Jewish communities of Paul's day, of which the sect known as the Way was a part, would have made it nearly improbable and nearly impossible for Paul to put this type of issue to a popular vote. Israel wouldn't have had anything. It had any of it. It would have been nearly a stonable offense for Paul to teach the abrogation of Sabbath, or at the very least, make it so that it's a vote. A voluntary issue. Go back and read Acts 24:14 for that. And then the last bullet point for that we'll look at tonight, and we'll turn to this more next week, is that in Paul's day, thousands of Jews believed in Yeshua by the first century. The Greek actually has multiple myriads of multiple thousands of Jewish believers, and many were zealous for the Torah. Go back and read Acts 21:20 to see where I'm lifting that information. And this fact alone, I say, makes a purported, quote, personal allowance to switch from Sabbath to Sunday worship via this verse, end quote, a virtual historic improbability. And so there are 4 bullet points that you have. Go investigate them on your own. It's possible that this is a Sabbath versus Sunday debatable issue, but it's highly improbable, highly unlikely that this is a Sabbath versus Sunday, let's choose whichever day is best for you type of issue. So that's where we're going to be going in this particular study. Does it mean that I judge people for not choosing Sabbath over Sunday? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I don't judge anyone. Do I look down my nose on people who choose Sunday versus Sabbath? Absolutely not. I don't look down on people for doing that as well. We're all at different places in our walk with God. We're all at different places in our Torah observance. Even Jewish people who come to a belief in Jesus are putting on Torah observance in stages and layers. And so none of us has the right to judge another believer or even another brother. We'll talk about what that means later on. For whatever amount of Torah that he's keeping or not keeping at the time. We're all at different places in our walk with God. And sometimes we're going through different stages and phases of growth in our walk with God. And so we don't have a right to judge one another. We simply have to come along, and as we understand scriptures, maybe a little bit better than our fellow brother pew sitter, the person sitting next to us, we can come along and pull out the Bible and say, hey, brother, let me show you a passage that God showed me and show you why I think this is something that's important to us as believers and why I think we should be keeping these things or why we shouldn't be keeping these things. What do you think? And then gently instruct one another and help one another grow in our walk and grow in our faith, because none of us is perfect. None of us has arrived. None of us has a corner store on the market of truth. And so that's where I'm going in this particular assessment. Amen? Amen.